How you doing, boys and girls? It is great to see you today. Do you know what it means to take a risk? It means to do something dangerous. Taking a risk is often dangerous because taking a risk means that you might lose something that's important to you. For instance, if you see a friend getting ready to do something that could hurt themselves, telling on them is risky business because they might get mad at you. Do you know what? Sometimes it's necessary to take a risk in order to get something that's even more important than what we stand to lose. So you might lose their friendship if you tell on them, but you might save them from getting hurt. And that's even better. The Bible is full of stories of people who take risks. One of whom was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had been to all sorts of doctors looking for a cure. In fact, she had spent all of her money paying for those doctors to treat her. But nothing helped. They couldn't stop it. Well, then she heard about Jesus. And she knew that if she could get near enough to Jesus just to touch his robe, she'd finally be well. There was a big problem. You see, because she was bleeding, it made her an outcast in society, and she wasn't what they called clean. Okay, and that meant being unclean. She was not allowed to touch any other person, and no one could touch her. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it would have been like? For 12 years, not even her own family could give her a hug. It was as if she wasn't even there. That had to be awful for her. 12 years. 12 years is longer than you guys have been alive. Still, the woman knew that if she could just touch Jesus' robe, she was going to get well. There's another problem. Jesus had gotten pretty famous wherever he went, and there was usually this big crowd, and it may have looked something like this, okay? Well, just imagine that Jesus is right there in the middle of all these people. How easy would it have been to get to Jesus? Not very, huh? Could we have gotten to him without touching anyone? I don't think so. So you see what a big risk this woman was taking. She wasn't allowed to touch anyone. And yet she was going to worm her way through this whole crowd of people, and she was going to try and get close enough to Jesus so that she could touch his robe. If anyone realized who she was and what she was doing, she could have gotten killed. She was taking a really big risk. But for her, the risk was worth it. Because for her life, well, it wasn't good, and she wasn't ready to go. So she went walking down the road to find Jesus in the midst of all these people. And she finally managed to get close enough to touch the hem of Jesus' robe. And instantly she felt Jesus' power flow through her, and she was healed, and she stopped bleeding. But you know what? Jesus felt his power flow out of him, and he knew that someone had touched him. In fact, he turned to his disciples and he said, "Who touched me?" They actually kind of laughed at him for saying such a thing. They're like, "Really? Well, look at all these people. Look around, Jesus. You're in the middle of a huge group. How are we supposed to know who touched you?" Could have been anyone. Well, the woman, she heard Jesus' question too. And so even though she knew people would probably recognize her as the unclean one, and she might get in all sorts of trouble, she came to Jesus and she said, I'm the one who touched your robe. And you know what Jesus did? Jesus wasn't angry at all. He said to her, daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. You know, sometimes our faith requires us to take risks. Some people think I'm afraid to take a risk for God because I close the church services when Governor Wolf asks us to. But you know what? We aren't in church today because I don't want to risk any of you or your families getting sick from COVID. That was a hard decision for me to make, and not everyone's happy about it. But I want you to know that I am willing to risk people being mad at me if it will even keep one person in our congregation safe. You know, it also helps to remember that God takes risks too. God took an enormous risk by giving us the freedom to choose what we're going to do and how we're going to act and who we're going to love. God for sure wants our love, but God will not force us to give it to him. If God did, then it wouldn't mean as much. And so God takes a risk on you and me, giving us life and freedom to choose how we are going to live. Now for God, that's a risk worth taking. Just the possibility of us loving God is worth the risk for God. God risks everything on us, even his only son Jesus, all in the hope that we will risk everything on God. Living for God is risky business, but I hope it's a risk worth taking for you too. Amen? Amen.